In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. In the ancient world, kings had complete control over the records of their reigns, allowing them to conceal their failures. However, this is not the case with the biblical king's records. These chapters are inspired by the Holy Spirit. They serve as a wake-up call to us, reminding us that none of us are sinless. 1 Samuel 13:14. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Even David, a man after God's own heart, can fail to guard his heart and rebel against God's will. These chapters also assist us in comprehending the ramifications of the king's sins. As a result of his failure to resist temptation, David, his family, and his kingdom would suffer a great deal of grief and rebellion. The issue arose in the spring, when kings marched out to war. Instead of fighting alongside his men, David dispatched Joab and his army while he remained in Jerusalem for unspecified reasons. From the first verse of the chapter, the author makes it clear that David should have been doing something else with his time. Temptation frequently chooses to pounce when we are not doing what we should be doing. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David was on the palace roof one night when he noticed a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman. David was at the pinnacle of his power. For 20 years, he had walked triumphantly with God as Israel's anointed king. He was a prophet and a singer from Israel who wrote many psalms. On that particular evening, however, this married man was captivated in all the wrong ways by somebody else's wife. This was not an immoral man, nor was he looking to fall. This was a man who put himself in danger and let down his guard. The consequences would be costly, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. 2 Samuel 11:3 and 4. It didn't take long for David to realize the woman was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's most trusted and loyal soldiers. But by this point, nothing mattered to David except satisfying his lust. So he dispatched messengers to find her, and when she arrived, he slept with her. In the end, we don't know how Bathsheba felt about it. However, we are given no reason to believe she was attempting to seduce David. He remained behind while his troops fought battles. When he should have been sleeping, he went out for a stroll on his rooftop. He had the wife of another man brought to him. David was the king, and his every command had to be followed. Bathsheba was a defenseless person. David is entirely to blame. 2 Samuel 11:5-8. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." So David sent his word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. David may have assumed that his encounter would be forgotten quickly. If so, he was mistaken. Soon after, David received shocking news from Bathsheba. "I am pregnant," she said in her message. The king had made the biggest blunder of his life. Instead of seeking to repair the damage through repentance, he made it infinitely worse through scheming. Uriah was brought home from the battlefield by David, who encouraged him to stay at home for a few days and spend time with his wife. Uriah, David reasoned, would take advantage of the opportunity to sleep with her, assuming the upcoming baby was his, and David would be exonerated. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark in Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink, and make love to my wife. As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. 2 Samuel 11, 9-13. David tried everything, including getting Uriah drunk, but he couldn't get the faithful soldier to sleep with his wife. Uriah was far too honorable to do so. He was aware that his fellow soldiers were away from their own wives, fighting the nation's battles. The contrast between David's disreputable plotting and Uriah's open honesty could not be more striking. 2 Samuel 11, 14 and 15. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in the front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." Uriah was buried because David was desperate to bury his sin. This is what sin will do to you if you do not confess and deal with it. When Uriah didn't do what David wanted, David went from cunning to cruel. He returned Uriah to the battlefront, where Israel's soldiers were besieging Rabbah, the Ammonite capital. Unbeknownst to him, the soldier was carrying his own death notice. 2 Samuel 11, 16-21. So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Didn't a woman drop an upper milestone on him from the wall, so that he died in the Bez? Why did you go so close to the wall?' If he asks you this, then say to him, 'Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead.'" The man after God's own heart became more and more cold-hearted. Although there is no indication that Joab knew the reason for the poor man's sentence, he obeyed the king's orders as recorded in verse 15. Uriah died as a result, because Joab anticipated that David would want to know about the battle as soon as possible. He dispatched a messenger with the news, cautioning him that the king might become enraged at such suicidal military strategy. If that happened, Joab instructed the messenger to say, "Your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead." In other words, he was reminding him that battle tactics had been used to achieve the king's goal. 2 Samuel 11, 22-25. The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, "The men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." David told the messenger, "Say this to Joab, 'Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it.' Say this to encourage Joab." David was pleased because the messenger delivered his message word for word. He was so hardened by his sin that he basically said to Joab, "Don't let Uriah's death bother you. You have some wins and some losses. Everyone must die at some point." In other words, this godly man had faded into the background. At first, a person who is in moral sin may feel bad about it. However, if the sin is not dealt with, the sinner's heart eventually becomes calloused. The guilt he should feel for his sin does not reach him. He goes spiritually numb and his sins multiply. 2 Samuel 11, 26-27. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Bathsheba wept for her husband Uriah. She later married David. Meanwhile, David had tainted his legacy with adultery and murder. Following the marriage, the cover-up was complete in David's opinion. Uriah had moved out of the way. The child would appear to be legal. The situation could be resolved. But David had forgotten about his all-knowing, all-present God, about whom he would write, "You understand my thoughts. Where can I flee from your presence? Even the darkness is not dark to you." Psalm 139, 2, 7, and 12. David had acted in secret, but nothing is hidden from the God who sees and knows all. The Lord considered what David had done to be evil. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him." 2 Samuel 12, 1-4. Nathan the prophet was sent by the Lord to confront David. But rather than simply laying out David's sin and demanding a confession, Nathan let him hang himself. He related a story about injustice. A rich man had taken advantage of a poor man by stealing his prized ewe lamb. Despite having an abundance of flocks, the rich man slayed the poor man's lamb and fed it to his guest. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." 2 Samuel 12, 5 and 6. The crime was so obvious and cruel that David jumped to the defense of the injured party. He was infuriated and said, "As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. Because he has done this thing and shown no pity, he must pay 4 lambs for that lamb." Sadly, though, David had no idea that the tale was a parable of his own actions. The rich man represented David, the poor man represented Uriah, and the ewe lamb represented Bathsheba. David's sin had blinded him. In condemning the rich man, he condemned himself. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the rich man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you. He will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." 2 Samuel 12, 7-12. Nathan responded quickly, "You are the man." The prophet then described how God had blessed David as well as how David had sinned against God. The Lord had given David everything, including Saul's wives, who would become servants of the king and his kingdom, because there is no evidence that David married them. David had repaid the Lord with evil. Then Nathan delivered God's verdict. The sword will never leave your house. Assault, murder, and rebellion would plague David's family from then on. David's humiliation would include having his wives taken from him and given to someone else. We would learn later that it was his own son Absalom who would sleep with them in public. Then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David had pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights laying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused. and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him that the child is dead? He may do something desperate. 2 Samuel 12:13-18. David's eyes finally opened up. As a man of God, he responded, "I have sinned against the Lord." David deserved to die for adultery and murder, according to Moses' law. Nonetheless, God graciously pardoned him and spared his life. Nonetheless, there would be serious consequences, beginning with Bathsheba's baby's death. The child became terminally ill. Despite God's judgment through Nathan, David pleaded with God for the boy, fasting, praying, and hoping that God would reconsider. Members of David's household saw him in such agony that when the baby died, David's servants were afraid to tell him for fear he would do something desperate. David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. "Is the child dead?" he asked. "Yes," they replied, "he is dead." Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on his lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went into his own house, and at his request, they served him food, and he ate. His attendants asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat." He answered, "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." 2 Samuel 12:19-23. David could tell by the whispers of his servants that the infant had passed. Realizing that God's will had been accomplished, he broke his fast and resumed his life. His servants were taken back by the king's sudden change of heart, but he explained that there was no longer any hope that the baby would return to him, because death was final. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah. 2 Samuel 12:24-25.